Hey, what's up, YouTube? My very first YouTube video. Hopefully somebody watches it and gets inspired to build their own building. That is the whole point of this video. And it is all about that building right there. A 10 by 16 shed. It has a 6 by 7 roll-up door and a 3 by 3 window. And hopefully enough information in this video so you can confidently build one as well. First, we cut two 2 by 6 by 16 rim joists. We marked them 16-inch on center, and then we nailed our floor joists going across that. Those are cut at 114 inches wide. And then we nailed on our two outer rim joists, another 16-foot piece on the outside of each one, just to beef it up and give it a little bit more rigidity to it so it doesn't sag. We set those on top of 4 by 6 skids. Just so in that way nothing warps or tweaks. It's just a good solid building. So these are our rim joists, and so I like to clamp them together so they're both even and lay out both sides at the same time. So we are going to do our floor with 16 on center joists. So we're just going to start at the beginning and we're going to mark where our first joist goes and draw an X. And then as we go on the way down, we need to be 16 on center. So starting from the end at our 16 mark, we want the center of our joist to be there. So we're going to measure over 3/4 of an inch this way and 3/4 of an inch this way. And we're going to mark it with an X. And I'll explain why that's important as we get a little bit further down. You'll understand why we do it that way. So your tape measure has all your red marks. So here's a 4-foot mark. When we get to the 8-foot, it'll make sense. And it's right here. So what we're gonna do is your sheets of plywood are 4 foot long, 4 foot wide by 8 feet long. So we need that plywood to seam here and have our next one continue on its way. And then, you know, our next one we would stagger them, so that's only gonna be 4 foot, and then we're gonna go our 8. So it's important to remember that. A 2 by 6 doesn't measure out to 2 inches, it measures out 1.5 by 5.5. And it's also important to remember that just because you bought a 2 by 6 that's 16 feet long, they're longer. This one's 193.25 inches. Oddly enough, they both are. That's pretty rare. Normally they're off by a bit, especially Green Street lumber. So we have our cut. This has to be cut off. So another thing we want to do when we're laying out our joists, or if you're building a wall, is all boards have a crown. They curve one way or another. If you're really picky at the lumber yard, you can pick the straightest ones you can find, and it's hard to see. If you get lumber delivered, some of them are bad, and you just have to make do with it. So it's important to pay attention to. These were all hand picked out, so I don't know if you can kind of see, but how this board arcs up. I don't know if the camera's gonna work. Whereas this way, it kind of arcs down. Maybe you can kind of see that. Yeah. So then we just mark it with an arrow, so we remember which way's up. And we do that for all of our joists. Another thing is, you've seen how we laid these out. One step that I like to do that's just a bit further than the average contractor is I also put a line on this side. You don't have to mark both sides, just one, but it's important to get your floor joists standing upright. If they're crooked, as you put weight in, they bow and your floor gets bouncy. So you want them as upright as possible. I know a lot of people, it's just a shed. Well, I know, but the old saying is, you know, doesn't have to be perfect. We're not building a liquor store. Some people don't drink. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're not building a church, but some people aren't religious. I like the one, if you want it to be built like Tom Silva built it, you better build it the way Tom Silva would build it. And if you argue with how he builds things, maybe you shouldn't be doing any projects, because he's kind of the man. So when we're laying out our floor joists and we're measuring them to cut, you want to make sure that you put your tape wherever it lands. If it lands in the middle of the board, you're going to mark the middle of the board. Because if you hook, I'll show you for example, if you hook on one corner and you measure diagonally across it and you hit your 14, versus if you went straight at your 14, when you draw your line, your cut line, so this is where we measure diagonal, versus had we measured where we were supposed to measure, so we're a straight line, you can see that we're off by 1/8 of an inch. Now, some people might say, well, it's just a shed and it's 10 feet, what's 1/8 of an inch? Well, your 1/8 of an inch on your floor, and then 1/8 of an inch on your walls, and 1/8 of an inch on your ceiling, by the time you're done, you're off by a 1/2 inch or maybe even more. And when you start sheathing and doing those sorts of things, or putting in doors and windows, that's a real problem. So always make sure that when you're laying out your cut marks, that you're as accurate as possible, because a little bit of time now is going to save you a lot of time later. And everybody has their own little ways of how they make their little triangles for their cut marks. I like to leave one tail of my triangle, my little arrow long, to remind me of which side of the line I need to cut on. So an example is that, so I know that I'm going to cut on this side of my line. And it's just a helpful reminder. Also, we chose to go with 2x6s for our floor. And the reason we chose 2x6s is because typically you don't want to extend a board more than 1.5 times its thickness. So what that means is a 2x6 plus half of that is 3. So you can stretch a 2x6 9 feet. So the more a sturdy way would have been to do 2x8s, because you can extend that 12 feet. But being in a neighborhood with an association and things like that, we're limited on our height. And so to save ourselves just a couple inches, we did 2x6s, because this building can't be visible from the road. And that's just the way that worked out. But we're really not putting anything heavy in it. We're just keeping, bikes and fishing poles and things like that. So we're not really too concerned. We could have probably even done 2x4s and then just put another skid in the middle of the floor, but that makes it hard to level. So we're doing it this way. Plus, we built a lot of buildings 10 feet wide with 2x6s, and it works out pretty well. If you're putting heavier things in, you could always put your floor joists closer together. Maybe do 12 inches on center as opposed to 16s. So it's another option. So we're just gonna finish these up and start laying out the floor. So one thing we should talk about is fasteners. When you build a shed or house or whatever you're building, fasteners get really expensive, but it's important to use the right ones. So for putting our floor together, we're using AC2 pressure treated lumber. And you can't just put any old nail in, because the chemical that they pump in it will rot your nail out. Important thing you want to look for is it has the ACQ label on it. If it does not have that label, you can't shoot it into pressure treated wood. Your nails will just rot out and everything will fall apart. So important to know. These ones, I would have preferred a ring shank nail. They didn't have any. It's just kind of the nature of COVID and now the hurricane. So we're just doing a 3 1/4 inch, 0.131 diameter, a smooth shank, hot dip galvanized nail. Once we got all that done and squared up and we measured diagonally and make sure that diagonal measurements equaled the same amount, then we went ahead and glued down and nailed on 3/4 inch plywood. Of course, our plywood and our 2x6s is all pressure treated ground contact lumber. You don't want to use conventional lumber on anything that touches the ground or gets wet, because eventually it will rot out, and we certainly don't want that to happen. All right, guys, we are reaching the end of our video, the part where I tell you to like and subscribe to our channel. Ring that bell so you get notified for part 2. Follow along in the rest of this build. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any tips for me, something that I missed, something that I should tell subscribers, leave a comment. I would love comments and I will address them as needed. Thank you very much.